The night was calm, the city lights glowing in the distance as James Carter drove home after a long day. He had just closed a big business deal, and his mind was filled with thoughts of the future. Dressed in a simple but neat outfit, he looked like any other hardworking man just trying to get home. His black SUV moved smoothly along the empty road, music playing softly in the background. As he turned onto a quieter street, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared behind him. The sound of sirens broke the peaceful silence. James frowned but remained calm. He checked his speed. He wasn't going too fast. He wasn't breaking any rules. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road and waited. Two police officers, Reed and Collins, stepped out of the patrol car. Both men had been on the force for years. They carried themselves with the confidence of people who believed they were in control. As they approached the vehicle, James rolled down his window, his face polite but firm. "Good evening, officers," he said. Reed leaned down, shining his flashlight into the car, taking his time before speaking. "License and registration." James nodded and reached into the glove box, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstanding. He had been through random stops before. He knew how to stay calm. He handed over his documents, watching as Collins walked around his car, peering inside as if looking for something suspicious. Reed glanced at the license, then at James. "Where are you coming from?" "Just finished some work downtown. Heading home now," James replied evenly. Collins suddenly knocked on the back window. "Step out of the vehicle." James hesitated for a second, but did as he was told. He knew arguing wouldn't help. The night air was cooler now as he stood on the sidewalk, hands in clear view. Reed walked to the driver's seat and casually looked inside. His eyes locked on something on the passenger seat, a thick envelope filled with cash. It was money from James's deal earlier that day. He had planned to deposit it in the morning. Reed picked up the envelope, shaking his head. "That's a lot of money. What's this for?" James kept his voice calm. "It's mine. Business earnings." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Business, huh? You got proof?" James sighed. "I can show you the details, bank transfers." Before he could finish, Reed smirked and tucked the envelope into his jacket. "We'll have to take this as evidence." James's heart pounded, but he didn't let his face show his anger. "That's not right," he said firmly. Collins stepped closer. "You don't want to cause trouble, do you?" James knew the game they were playing. He had seen it before. He could argue, he could demand justice, but he also knew how these situations usually ended. So he took a deep breath, memorized their faces, and made a decision. This wasn't over. Reed and Collins drove away, laughing as if they had just won a prize. The envelope of cash sat between them, and the weight of it made them feel powerful. It wasn't the first time they had done this, and they were sure it wouldn't be the last. They had been officers for years, and they knew exactly how to bend the rules in their favor. If anyone complained, it never went anywhere. They had done this before, and nothing had ever happened. "This guy really thought he could argue with us," Collins chuckled, shaking his head. Reed smirked, tapping the envelope. "Yeah, but now we've got ourselves a little bonus for the month." Meanwhile, James stood by his car, watching their taillights disappear into the night. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had money, success, and respect, but none of that mattered at this moment. These officers had seen a black man with cash and assumed they had the right to take it. James took a deep breath. He had worked too hard to let this go. He could have fought them right there, demanded justice, but he knew that would have only made things worse. He needed to be smart. He needed to be patient. Getting back into his car, he checked his phone. He had recorded everything, every word, every action. It wasn't the first time he had been in a situation like this, but it would be the last time anyone tried to take advantage of him. He had a plan, and soon those officers would realize the mistake they had made. The next morning, Reed and Collins walked into the station as if nothing had happened. They joked with their fellow officers, sipped their coffee, and went about their usual routine. In their minds, they had already forgotten about James. To them, he was just another person they had taken advantage of, someone who would never fight back. But something was different in the station that day. A buzz of excitement ran through the department. The chief had called for an important meeting. Every officer was expected to attend. Reed and Collins didn't think much of it. They took their usual seats in the briefing room, waiting for the meeting to begin. Then the door opened and silence filled the room. A tall, confident man in a sharp suit stepped inside, his presence commanding attention. His eyes scanned the room, calm and unreadable. And then he locked eyes with Reed and Collins. Their smirks disappeared. Their bodies stiffened. Because standing before them, as their new boss, was the man they had robbed the night before, James Carter. The room was completely silent. Every officer in the department sat still, waiting for the meeting to begin. But for two men, Reed and Collins, time seemed to stop. Their faces paled, their backs stiffened, and their hands clenched under the table. The man standing in front of them was no ordinary visitor. It was James Carter, the same man they had pulled over, the same man they had stolen money from just hours ago. James stood tall, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression calm but powerful. He didn't look angry. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man in control. Slowly, he walked to the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the curiosity, the uncertainty. Then, the police chief stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to meet Mr. James Carter. He is the new head of internal affairs, and he will be overseeing cases of misconduct within the department." A few officers murmured among themselves. Others nodded with respect. But Reed and Collins, their world felt like it was collapsing. James finally spoke. His voice was steady, strong. "Good morning, everyone. I want to start by saying that I respect the work you do. Law enforcement is not an easy job, and I know that many of you serve with honor and dedication." Some officers straightened up, feeling proud. But James continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We also know that not everyone follows the rules. Some officers believe that their badge gives them the power to do whatever they want, to take advantage of the people they swore to protect." Reed and Collins swallowed hard. They could feel James's words cutting through them like a knife. "That is why I'm here," James went on, "to make sure that justice is not just a word, but a reality for everyone. My job is to investigate corruption and ensure that those who abuse their power are held accountable." He let his words sink in. The weight of them settled over the room like a heavy cloud. Then, with a small smile, he added, "And let me assure you, justice always finds its way." Reed shifted uncomfortably. Collins wiped the sweat forming on his forehead. They had spent years bending the rules, thinking they were untouchable. But now, sitting just a few feet away from the very man they had stolen from, they realized something terrifying. They weren't untouchable anymore. The meeting continued, but Reed and Collins barely heard a word. Their minds raced. Their hearts pounded. Should they confess, apologize, or stay quiet and hope James didn't recognize them? One thing was certain. This was not going to end the way they had expected. Reed and Collins sat frozen in their seats long after the meeting had ended. Their minds raced, their palms felt sweaty, and their stomachs twisted in knots. Every officer around them got up, chatting about their new boss, some even excited about the changes he might bring. But for these two, the room felt like a trap closing in. James Carter was not just another businessman. He was not just another man they could push around. He was now their superior, the one with the power to investigate and punish officers who abused their authority. And worst of all, he had every reason to come after them. Reed leaned toward Collins, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he remembers us?" Collins swallowed hard, eyes darting to where James stood across the room, speaking with the police chief. "I don't know," he muttered. but we can't take any chances. James, meanwhile, was fully aware of the two officers watching him. He could feel their nervous energy, the way they avoided looking directly at him. He could see the guilt in their stiff movements. He hadn't forgotten what they had done. He hadn't forgotten the way they had smiled while taking his money, thinking he was powerless. But James wasn't a man who acted on anger alone. He believed in justice, not revenge, and justice required patience. As he finished his conversation with the chief, James casually glanced in Reed and Collins's direction. A small, knowing smile played on his lips before he turned and walked away. That simple look sent a shiver down Collins's spine. "He knows," he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Reed took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "We don't know that for sure." Then why did he smile like that? Reed had no answer. His mind was already trying to figure out their next move. Should they lay low, try to act normal, maybe even get rid of any evidence that could tie them to last night? Collins shook his head. "We messed up. Man, this is bad." For the rest of the day, the two officers found it hard to focus on their work. Every time James walked past, their bodies tensed. Every time he spoke, their ears perked up, afraid he was about to call them out. But James did nothing, yet. Instead, he spent the day reviewing files, speaking with other officers, and getting familiar with the department. He asked questions about past complaints, about officers who had been reported for misconduct. His presence alone sent a wave of unease through the station. By the time the shift ended, Reed and Collins felt exhausted, not from work, but from fear. As they stepped outside, Collins whispered, "We need a plan." Reed nodded. "Yeah, before he makes his move." Little did they know, James had already made his first move, and soon the truth would come crashing down on them. The sun had set by the time Reed and Collins left the station, but neither of them felt relief. Their usual routine, grabbing dinner, laughing about the day, was gone. Instead, a heavy silence hung between them as they walked to their cars. "We need to talk," Collins muttered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Reed nodded and motioned toward a quiet parking lot down the street. They got into Reed's car, locking the doors before either of them spoke. Collins ran a hand over his face. "This is bad. If he knows, we're done." Reed clenched his jaw. "We don't know if he has proof." "Are you serious? He's the head of internal affairs. His whole job is to find proof." Collins's voice was rising, his fear turning into frustration. "You saw the way he looked at us. That wasn't a normal look. That was a 'I got you' look." Reed exhaled slowly, thinking, "Okay, let's say he does know. What's he gonna do? If he had enough evidence, he would have already confronted us." Collins shook his head. "Unless he's waiting, gathering more information, making sure we don't have a way out." The thought sent a chill through both of them. James wasn't acting out of anger. He was being patient, calculated. That made him even more dangerous. Collins leaned forward. "We have two choices. We act like nothing happened and hope he lets it go. Or what?" Reed snapped. "Run. Quit. That'll make us look guilty." Collins bit his lip. "No. We make sure there's nothing for him to find. No evidence. No case." Reed went silent. He knew exactly what Collins meant. Get rid of the money. Delete anything suspicious. Make sure no one could connect them to what happened. Collins continued, "Listen, we've gotten away with stuff before. We just have to be careful. No mistakes." Reed sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine, but we need to be smart about it." That night, they made their moves carefully. The stolen money, gone. Any old complaints against them, covered up. They erased every possible trail that could lead James back to them. But what they didn't know was that James had already started gathering his own evidence. He had access to old complaints, body cam footage, and testimonies from people who had been too scared to speak before. He wasn't just after them for what they did to him. He was after them for everything they had done to others. As Reed and Collins went to bed, thinking they had cleaned up their mess, James sat in his office, reviewing a file with their names on it. A small smile formed on his lips. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea what was coming next. Reed and Collins walked into the station the next morning, trying to act normal. They forced small talk with other officers, laughed at jokes, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, they were on edge. Every glance from a coworker, every whisper in the hallway, made them wonder, was James onto them? James, on the other hand, remained calm. He had spent the night going through reports, looking at complaints against officers, and speaking with people who had suffered because of corruption in the department. He already knew Reed and Collins weren't the only ones involved in wrongdoing, but they were his first target. By noon, James walked through the station with purpose. He had called a private meeting with a few trusted officers, the police chief, and the department's legal team. Reed and Collins weren't invited. Collins noticed first. He nudged Reed and whispered, "He's up to something." Reed followed James with his eyes, trying to stay calm. "We don't know that." But Collins wasn't convinced. "He's meeting with the chief. That's not normal." Reed tried to brush it off, but doubt crept into his mind. He thought they had erased all evidence, but what if James had something else? What if someone had spoken against them? Inside the private meeting room, James placed a file on the table. "I've reviewed multiple complaints," he said. "Many of them involved the same names." The officers and legal team leaned in. The chief frowned. "And what do you suggest?" James opened the file. "I want a full internal investigation, but I need it to be quiet. For now." The chief hesitated. "If these officers have been breaking the law, they need to be held accountable." James nodded. "Exactly. But if we act too soon, they might try to run or cover their tracks. I need to catch them off guard." The chief agreed, and James left the room, knowing his plan was working. Meanwhile, Reed and Collins were growing restless. Every passing hour felt like a countdown to their downfall. When James walked past them, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His silence was worse than any threat. Collins finally lost his patience. "We need to do something." Reed exhaled. "Like what?" Collins lowered his voice. "We need to find out what he knows, before it's too late." Reed nodded. They had gotten away with things for years. But this time, it was different. This time, the man they had wronged had the power to destroy them. And deep down, they both knew time was running out. Reed and Collins sat in their patrol car outside the station, their minds racing. They had always felt untouchable, but now, for the first time, they felt powerless. James wasn't just any man seeking justice. He was smart, patient, and already 2 steps ahead of them. Collins tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. "We need to find out what he's planning." Reed nodded, staring out the window. "Yeah, but how? We can't just walk into his office and ask." Collins thought for a moment. "What if we talk to someone on the inside? Someone who knows what's going on?" Reed raised an eyebrow. "And who would that be?" Collins smirked. "Samantha." Samantha was a clerk in the records department. She handled reports, complaints, and case files. If James was building a case against them, she might know. That evening, they found her in the break room. Collins put on his usual charm. "Hey, Sam. Heard there's some big investigation going on. You know anything?" She sipped her coffee and shrugged. "I don't know much. Just that Mr. Carter has been pulling a lot of old files and talking to the chief." Reed forced a smile. "Any names come up?" She narrowed her eyes. "Why are you asking?" Collins chuckled, playing it off. "Just curious. If there's a big shakeup, we'd like to be prepared." Samantha hesitated, then leaned in. "All I know is he's looking into cases where officers were accused of misconduct. Some names have come up more than once." Reed and Collins exchanged a glance. Their fears were confirmed. James was digging into their past. That night, they met again in private. Collins clenched his fists. "We need to act now. If we wait, we're done." Reed sighed. "We could try talking to him. Maybe we can make a deal." Collins shook his head. "You really think he'll let this go? After what we did?" Reed didn't answer. He knew the truth. James wasn't the kind of man to back down. Collins lowered his voice. "Then we have one last option. We make sure he doesn't get the chance to finish what he started." Reed's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Collins leaned in, his face serious. "We take control of the situation before he does. If he can't prove anything, he can't touch us." Reed hesitated. This wasn't like before. This wasn't just about bending the rules. It was about survival. Collins placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's us or him." Reed swallowed hard. He knew Collins was right. But what they didn't know was that James had already expected this, and he was ready for them. Reed and Collins sat in their car, deep in thought. The weight of their actions pressed down on them. They had always believed they were in control, that they could bend the rules without consequences. But now, everything had changed. James Carter was different. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't backing down. Collins clenched his fists. "We can't sit around and wait. We have to stop him before he stops us." Reed hesitated. "And how do you plan to do that? He's not just some guy we can scare off." Collins smirked. "Everyone has a weakness. We just have to find his." But what they didn't realize was that James had already set his trap. The next morning, James arrived at the station as usual. He walked with confidence, his expression calm. But behind the scenes, everything was in motion. Overnight, he had gathered enough evidence, old complaints, witness statements, and even security footage that had been buried for years. Reed and Collins thought they had erased their tracks, but James had found what they missed. At noon, the police chief called for a department-wide meeting. Every officer was expected to attend. Reed and Collins shared a nervous glance but forced themselves to act normal. When everyone was seated, James stepped forward. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. "In this department, we wear the badge to serve and protect. But sometimes, people forget what that truly means." Murmurs spread across the room. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. James continued. "For too long, certain individuals have used their position for personal gain. They thought no one was watching. They thought they could get away with it." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he turned toward the chief and handed him a file. "But today that ends." The chief opened the file, his eyes scanning the pages. His expression hardened. "Officers Reed and Collins," he said firmly, "please step forward." The room fell silent. Reed's heart pounded. Collins's face turned pale. Every pair of eyes in the room was now on them. Collins forced a laugh. "Chief, what's this about?" James didn't blink. "It's about justice." Two internal affairs officers stepped forward. "Officers Reed and Collins, you are under investigation for multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and theft." Collins opened his mouth to protest, but James cut him off. "We have the evidence. Witnesses have spoken. The truth is out." Reed felt his world crumble. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable, but now, standing in front of his fellow officers, he realized the truth. Justice had caught up with him. The officers led them away, their badges taken, their heads low. James watched them go, then turned back to the room. "This is just the beginning," he said. "From now on, we do things the right way." The station remained silent, but the message was clear. A new era had begun.